Well, good day, people. Hope everyone is well. I thought I would try to maybe spend a little time today to talk about Jacques Lacan's distinctions between the real, symbolic, and the imaginary. And I wanted to say right now that this is going to be a quick, glib, off the cuff, cocktail party version. If you are a serious Lacanian, this is probably going to irritate you and you won't like the video very much. I'm going to try to just open up the discussion of some of these and offer some of the ways that his ideas have, I guess, been applied and taken in some forms of communication theory. I would say, go check out some of Richard Lanigan's work, Anthony Wilden's work. At any rate, what I'm going to do here is try to talk a little bit about what he means by the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. Okay, so I think the first thing is you can see that they're all subsets, and the real is the most basic category. And I think first off, he doesn't mean reality as if a scientific world picture out there of things to be analyzed. You want to see this as the pre-categorical, the pre-thought, the pre-conscious. This is the the basic structure of experience. And again, you can't even use the word experience. It gets a little tricky. I mean, you want to think of it as the bed ground of what will become experienced categories once it becomes symbolically appropriated. And so the symbolic is a subset of the real. Now, the general characteristic of the real is both and. When we say both and, we mean that anytime you pull a symbolic category of of a couple of items, and I have a list of items there. So, presence, absence, male, female, human, nature, light, dark, good, evil, life, death, fact, fiction, pleasure, pain. In each one of these, they're distinctions that we can make symbolically. And when we do that, we can say one of them and treat them as if you're having one or the other, and you have a notion of both of them. But at the level of the real, they're not really there. It's such a both and. It's that one, and they're both there so simultaneously, and that all the other categories are there so simultaneously that it can't really be delimited. It's an overflowing of what hasn't yet been demarcated by conscious abstracting processes. So it's again the real has this both and category, that this both and characteristic, which it just overflows, and it predates the the carving of particular distinctions and categories as they're understood in consciousness, which consciousness is a symbolic process, and it mediates. See, the symbolic is so important because it mediates between the real and the imaginary. So let me see if I can get to the imaginary. Now, the imaginary is the land of either or. When people can take those categories which have been pulled, the categories are created in the symbolic by pulling out of quotes the real, or releasing. Again, it's difficult to say how the symbolic appropriates what is overflowing in the real, but it some way releases these distinctions, these categories that we can treat as objects of thought, as items to cognitively help us understand the world. Again, we carve out these things. I mean, there isn't this real thing out in the world called human or nature or life or death or fact, but these are abstractions that consciousness has created. And as the symbolic creates this conscious world of discrete, meaningful objects of thought, it's all these distinctions that we can relate to and understand. The imaginary it's a kind of hyper fetishization which imagines, and again, it imagines that you could have one of the two, and it's as if you pick one, the other isn't there. It's as if the other is denied, and people can come to live in a kind of fetishized existence. It's in a kind of an imaginary existence. And when I say that, I mean that they've reduced the world to either or categories. And so if you take that string again, instead of seeing the world as both and presence and absence, and seeing that in the real, it's always male and female. I mean, that is the reality. The reality is you always have both and when I say both and, you have both of those and then countless other, such as human nature, light and dark, good and evil. I mean, there's just this overflowing of what's both and. At the symbolic, you can make calculations, you can reason, you can say, well, or you can say male or female, but you recognize that it's an and or, that there is this and now in a symbolic moment, you're going to separate one off for the purposes of thought. The imaginary, it takes the cleavages that attention has carved out and the fissures and treats them as if they were in the real. Now, we want to get this very clear. The imaginary is a subset of the real, and we don't want to think that the imaginary is set in contrast to the real. No, it's a subset of it. But the problem becomes when the person, they live within a narrowed horizon of imaginary reality. So it is part of the real, but it's an imaginary reality. And so look at the stream of terms now going down rather than across. I think in some way you could take dominant Western culture, and what you find is a hyper fetishization. It's a belief in presence of the male to the exclusion of the female, some notion of humans against nature, as if you could have a humanity without nature. We have this notion of light against dark. And so these terms that at the symbolic level are logically equivalent, at the imaginary level, they become quasi-narrative combatants. It's as if we imagine some story where one of them will vanquish the other, or as if one of them could be without the other. We have yearning, for example, of good without evil, of life without death. We, in some way, fetishize this notion that there could be a fact without fiction, as if there would be this ultimate reality which wouldn't have any fictional aspect to it. And that, again, that's a very imaginary notion. And the same with believing that you could have pleasure without pain. See, I mean, I think it's very easy to fall within, again, for lack of a better word, it's believing not only in the distinctions that the symbolic has carved out of the real, but now in just one tiny aspect of the symbolic, it's either or dimension. And so, again, what you see is that there is the capacity to think in terms of either or, but those are only imaginary. And when I say only imaginary, it's only in your imagination that you could have either one or the other. At the level of the symbolic, you always have them both, even though you can treat one independently. At the level of the real, it's there may be something there, but it completely surpasses what you could delimit. I mean, the real is a um, again, it's what predates the categories, distinctions, the signifier signifies, all the relations that the symbolic introduces. The conscious mind, which now believes in this imaginary world which it has constructed of either or categories, and is going to try to identify with one side of the category to the exclusion of the other. This is where it becomes a problem. And you can probably imagine what happens. I mean, people understand this, and one of their first thoughts is they say, oh, I see, it's both and rather than either or. And no, the point is that it's not either or both and. It's both and either or. Okay, thanks.